This tweet got me Twitter jailed. Come on, do it. Do it. God damn it. What am Oh, oops. I found a new one. This tweet got me Twitter jailed. Feminists expect men to take accountability for the behavior of a tiny minority of men who rape. At the same time, they consider it misogyny to regard women as being equally likely to rape. Receipts below. This really hit a nerve. And it didn't just hit a nerve with feminists. Apparently, it also hit a nerve with conservatives, which the going theory is what got me mass reported for spam. And yeah, I was knocked off of Twitter for several days. I ended up having to prove that I was a human, but for some reason, the Arcrose challenge was suffering technical difficulties that I couldn't resolve. So I kept going through it over and over again until my husband, Jonathan, actually helped me out and got me back on. But at that point, Twitter decided to flag me for behavior that was deceptive or manipulating the deceptive or attempting to manipulate the platform. And I asked them to review it. And of course, a couple days later, they said, oh, wait, no, you're not doing anything. You're not actually doing anything, which really begs the question. Again, this is just the theory that I got mass reported. But if Twitter reviewed it, my behavior, and found that there was nothing, like I hadn't engaged in anything against the platform, how did I end up being in the spam jail? Like, how does that happen? What was triggered? Like I said, it really looks like it was a mass report considering how much absolute butthurt I got over this particular tweet. If you think about it, though, the tweet is pretty benign. Like, we should be able to entertain the possibility that women rape as much as men. Okay? We should be able to look at that as a possibility and discern whether or not it's true. Just stating that is not an act of misogyny. Questioning it is not an act of misogyny. And yet, so many people got so upset over the very idea that you could question this law of the universe or something, that men are more sexually aggressive than women, that it's just the truth. We can't look at it because it's just the truth. It's unquestionable. Well, there's nothing unquestionable in science, right? We pose it as a question. Is it a predictive factor? Is being male or female a predictive factor when it comes to your sexual aggression? And the answer is increasingly looking like no. And so I put out the statistics I have, and I've been looking at this issue for decades now, so I have quite a bit of evidence. And again, one contrary result means you have to go back to the drawing board. You can't just keep ignoring them, okay, guys? You can't keep finding that women engage in potentially equal amounts of rape as men and then just be like, no, we're just going to keep ignoring that. You can't do that. And it's dishonest to do that. And it really invites a question. Why are people so upset when you say something, when you entertain the possibility that men are engaging or women are engaging in as much sexual violence as men? Why do people get so upset? Why is it so offensive? Why is it so emotional? What are people invested in here? And because I'm a curious person, and I also like to create theories, conjectures, hypotheses, I'm going to look into why I think various groups are invested in this particular narrative. I have listed them behind me. So it is the left, I believe. Let me just, yep, the left. This is very awkward, by the way. I hope you appreciate how much I'm sacrificing, how much spatial awareness effort I'm putting into this. And then the right, and then women, and then deep state. These are the groups that are most invested in the men are sex monsters narrative. And I'm going to give my level best. I'm going to do my level best to explain why. I could be wrong, but it seems like there's a lot of emotional conflict around something that should be just regarded as a potential truth. Okay? Like, there's no reason at this point in time to believe that men sexually aggressing more than women is a law of the universe. And there's significant evidence that it isn't true. So the very, very honest thing to conclude is we don't know. We need more non-ideologically motivated science, more science that actually accounts for all of the bars that prevent men from revealing, all the gates that prevent men from revealing the sexual abuse that they experience, either as adults or children, okay, or even recalling it properly, right? Because there's all kinds of conflicts with this. And I can step you through all of them, but that's not what this is about. What this is about isn't my evidence to question the commonly held truth, the commonly held belief that men sexually aggress more than women. My point here is to look at why people have such an emotional reaction to even questioning that. All right, I'm going to start with the left, right? The left uses this narrative that men sexually aggress against women in order to bolster their claims of a patriarchy, an inherent, and not just a patriarchy, but the idea of a patriarchy, an inherently unjust system that always requires government action to correct, which, if you think about it, is a really bizarre assertion, really self-contradictory. But yeah, so the left leans on the narrative that men use rape and sexual violence, the thing that triggers the most reptilian anger in humans. What a coincidence. They use that to insist that men are constructing an unfair system and that women need government oversight to fix it. Right? If you were a really cynical person, you might suggest that they're just using that reptilian loathing of rape and sexual violence against women and that desire to protect them in order to push their own whatever they want. I am that cynical, so I am going to assert it. There you go. That's what the left likes about this narrative. It turns people's brains off and makes them feel like they have to do something, which is the perfect moment for selling people on things that are not good for them. Selling people on losing their autonomy and their rights. Okay? That's very closely aligned to why the deep state likes this particular narrative. But that's why the left likes the narrative, because it turns women into eternal victims that are constantly needing to be saved. And who's going to save them? The left. All right. So why does the right like this narrative? Because it's constantly used as a way to generate fear against particular groups of men who represent phenomena that the right is against. Immigrant men. And there is an argument to be made that when you import men from violent and destabilized regions, you are going to import sexual problems. Or if you import men from regions that engage in child abuse against boys, you are going to, as a matter of tradition, in order to maintain female virginity, you are going to import sexual problems. And then there's also an argument to be made that a lot of these young immigrant men are also being preyed upon by female aid workers. This is something that I looked at years and years and years ago. Nobody wants to talk about it. Okay? You are going to import a sexual problem. And you don't deal with that by pretending it doesn't exist and trying to manipulate coverage of it. Right? So I'm not here saying that this isn't a problem, but it is how we construct a threat narrative against the whole concept of immigration, right? And against the concept of certain groups of men. And this is consistent throughout history. Conservative people who want to control, minimize, remove certain groups of men will construct a narrative against their sexuality. It's very useful. Right? I'm not saying it's always wrong, but not necessarily because they're men, but because they're coming from areas that are, full of social strife, full of people preying on each other, violence. That's going to be a problem. And you can't just say, oh, that isn't a problem. It's going to be a problem. It's not a problem because they're men. It's a problem because they have gone through shit. Right? Okay, and if you don't have the ability to manage that, it is unfair to expect a native population to just absorb that dysfunction. That's the argument I would use. But generally the argument is those minority men are rapey. I think that's simplistic and it's harmful and ultimately destructive to the relationship between men and women. But that's why the right likes the narrative. They've also been using it in terms of trans women to justify removing trans women from women's spaces. Again, I think that this is not necessarily the right way to approach it, because you are feeding into this particular narrative, which justifies all the left's crap. I mean, it's a weapon that the left uses better than the right. Let's face it. So you are continuing to perpetuate their weapon. I mean, maybe you want to. Maybe you should think about considering not doing that. Because it comes back to when you say that men are so dangerous that when they identify as women, they can't go into women's bathrooms or they can't be part of women's spaces, even though for whatever reason, women should have every right to walk into an entire locker room full of men, you know. But if a trans woman walks into a woman's locker room, all hell breaks loose. Even though you might want to consider the downstream effects of that. Because if you're saying men are that dangerous, you are justifying all the government oversight into your families, into any family with a man in it. Because he might blow up and start, raping his wife, raping his children, forcing patriarchy on them. You see that it's all connected. Now, how you would justify keeping women's spaces to women? Well, maybe just start recognizing the biological differences between men and women. Not just the biological uniqueness of women, but also of men. And recognizing that people who experience the world through that particular biological lens maybe should have the right to be able to be with others who are doing that without having to deal with the other gender. Like maybe consider that. But I guess that would require delegitimizing all of women's push into men's spaces. So the big thing that makes conservatives, the right, really love this men are sex monsters narrative is that it justifies excluding men or trans women from women's spaces while continuing to privilege women's access to men's spaces. You see, so men shouldn't, or trans women, because they're men, according to the right's appraisal, should not have access to women's spaces because they are sex monsters, because they are men. But women should continue to be able to have access to men's spaces because they are not sex monsters, and that's just fair. Right? So that's how you create that asymmetry. So instead of just appealing to gender differences and people wanting to associate with each other to try to maybe understand or just have a break from the opposite sex or be able to pursue their interests that are unique to their biological perspective, no. You have to construct a threat narrative against men so that you can continue to keep your privilege to access men's spaces as a woman. Beloved, that's what makes it useful to the right. All right, so what's it useful to the deep state? Because this narrative pretty much justifies welfare. It justifies why women need to be paid to leave their families because men are oppressing them. Right? Men are a threat to women. So we need to make it so that we protect women from men's choices because men are sexual predators. Right? Justifies welfare. It justifies all of the domestic violence industry, which further justifies all kinds of removing people's autonomy when it comes to family. It justifies even removing women's autonomy when it comes to choosing their partners. I remember this discussion when was it a TikTok influencer? She was potentially killed. I don't know. I don't remember. Don't quote me. I'm not trying to be wrong, but I don't remember if her boyfriend was convicted. But they were pulled over, and it looked like he was a victim of her. So he was physically injured by her, and the cops offered her, to take her away, and she didn't want to go. And I remember there was feminists talking about how they failed her. And I'm like, failed her by what? Respecting her autonomy? And that's the thing. This is what pushes. This is what all of this is pushing. Control over men's behavior. So being able to control men whenever they're in contact with women, and being able to control women whenever they're in contact with men. What does that mean? That means you control people completely. You take away their right to association, their right to freedom of speech, their freedom of movement. I mean, this is a justification for complete tyranny. Complete surveillance state tyranny. Complete surveillance state tyranny is like the end goal. That's the end game for the deep state. And this facilitates, this justifies it. We need to be protected from each other, or actually specifically, women need to be protected from men. That means all human interactions needs to go through the filter of the deep state. They need to be able to manage everything. Right? And then you turn around, and anybody who criticizes the deep state, what do they say? Oh, you just want to rape women and control their bodies. So once again, this is a weapon used to increase government oversight over everyone, families, children, men and women, and also justify, excuse, and protect any questioning into their activities. Right? You don't want to be a misogynist. You don't hate women. You don't want to see them harmed. Okay? And that's another aspect of why the deep state likes this narrative. It turns people's brains off. It makes them accept situations that are to their detriment. It makes them accept a loss of rights, an autonomy, and privacy. It's a very dangerous narrative, and that's another reason why I fight against it. Actually, you know what? I have a tweet I should read. Why do I focus on the sexual assault of men? Because ignoring it prevents the swamp from being drained. Here's why. Feminists discredit research that shows men and women are equally violent in relationships by saying women's violence is preemptive defense, aka inciting the man with physical and verbal abuse so that he explodes, which then releases his built-up domestic violence reserve, which then depletes and thus reduces her risk of extreme violence, or some shit. Yet, women sexually abuse in relationships at equal rates. Do women also engage in preemptive rape? No. Therefore, the best argument against feminist framing DV, domestic violence perpetration, as male only are the stats on the sexual abuse in relationships and the stats on the rate at which women sexually abuse. Now, why do feminists work so hard to keep people's perception of domestic violence as something men perpetrate? Because they use domestic violence and sexual assault to prove patriarchy. Specifically, they are using these human ills to prove that men use them to keep women in a state of compliance and fear while our society has no actual unequal laws. Well, that don't favor women or don't protect women. We do have unequal laws against men, specifically men's bodily autonomy, which we don't respect in the slightest. Distorting the statistics on domestic violence and sexual assault is essential to prove this slander against men as a group. And what do feminists do with this threat narrative against men? They sell it to the highest bidder. The current highest bidder is the deep state, aka the financial graft in Washington, D.C., or the equivalent in other Western nations, who use feminist dogma to justify expanding the administrative state and attacking its enemies. So that's why the deep state loves this narrative. And why now? This is the big controversial. This is the big kahuna. Why do women love this narrative? Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack with that. Let me just check to make sure I've got everything going properly. Okay. There's a lot to unpack with that. Why women like it. Hybistrophilia, I have probably butchered that word, but a sexual interest in criminal men is probably one. There's a lot of rape fantasy going around for women, which, men also have rape fantasies. That is the fantasy of being raped, by the way, not raping. Grape fantasies, sorry. Men also have grape fantasies, and so that is an element of it. There's a sexual fetishism element of it to this particular framework. But there's also an element of wanting to be right. Now, bear with me as I explain this. The big cultural inheritor, so the big cultural milieu that we came from is, of course, Christian. And in Christianity, and Christianity isn't unique in this. Christianity is just one of a number of religions or spiritual practices or philosophies that have created advanced civilizations and have this this expectation put on women that they submit to men. Right? Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Shintoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, they all have that component of expectation that women submit. And women don't want to. Okay? Women want to be right. And they want to be right in terms of being morally superior. And this whole narrative that men are sex monsters, sorry, I just requested an update, gives women moral authority over men because men are more fallen than they are. So they no longer have to do what the Bible tells them to do, which is submit to men. And before everybody gets their hackles up, let's look at what is meant by submission to men. Because I've actually looked up what submission means in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And I also want to compare it to the biblical expectation that children and servants or bondsmen obey their master and mistress. Because there's a distinction. Servants and children are meant to obey their parents, the heads of their households. Women are meant to submit. Now, when you look at the actual definition of submission, in I think Hebrew and Greek, it has a military element. So in Greek, it's like the submission to playground commands. So the submission a army gives their commander. So they submit to his orders. I believe that's similar in Hebrew. It's this act of submitting to command. In Latin, it seems to have a number of meanings, but also the meaning of yielding up. So to yield something up. So let me make an interpretation. The submission commanded of women is to yield up a social power that grants them the ability to basically make themselves the center of things, right? To be right. Right? And that social power is because women are our first experience of being human, of belonging. So they become primary in a way, emotionally primary. It's revealed in the biblical statement that men leave their mother and father and cleave to their wife. It's that emotional primacy. And it's in everything. It's in Women Are Wonderful. It's in women's in-group bias. It's in the fact that in formal settings, women dominate any kind of discussion. They tend to set the emotional agenda, right? You look at a video, and if something happens, who do they immediately pan to for the audience to know how they're supposed to emotionally react to the thing that they've just shown? A woman. Okay, so they set the emotional tenor of things. Okay, they have this primacy to them. And the idea is they yield that up to men. So where does the power sit? In the soldiers. And the soldiers yield themselves, their will up to the general. And why do they do it? Because they trust he knows what's going on. They trust that he is going to lead them correctly. And why do they trust that he is going to lead them correctly? Because he has knowledge that they don't. He has insight and skills that they don't. Or, some of them might be trying to rise up the ranks and demonstrate that they also have similar insight and skills. But regardless, they trust that he has those skills. He has that understanding that will lead them to victory. Right? So that's what submission means. It means that women, instead of using their primacy to silence men and to treat them as inferiors and second-class citizens, and to make it so that they are not heard and their perspective becomes marginalized and their particular understanding of the world becomes silenced, women submit that primacy so that men can be heard, men have a voice, and men can lead in the ways that they understand the world. Right? And what does that mean? Well, let's take it out of this. And again, every single major civilization has had this, some allusion to this, that women submit that kind of emotional primacy that they have, that emotional dominance, and they submit it to men. And if you understand men's outlook, you don't really need to submit because you understand it. You're just like, yes, I know what you're doing, and I'm just going to go along with it because I understand it. But regardless, every single civilization has told women this. Why? Well, let's step back from any kind of philosophy or religion or spirituality. Let's just think about how men and women evolved. All right? Okay. Men are half the human race. They are biologically different. They have a different approach. They tend to be less agreeable. They tend to be more systems orientated. And for everybody who's screaming their ass off, a lot of you would be 100%. If I said that women tend to be more emotional and relational and more interested in relationships with others, more interested in psychology and all, you wouldn't scream at me, would you? But the flip side of that is that men are more interested and understand to a greater degree systems, situations where one action leads to action 1, leads to action 2, leads to action 3, that kind of thing. Or action 1 leads to action A through Z, right? And then actions A through Z lead, that's what men understand. It's how they systematize the world. Okay? But systems, that ability to systematize, what does that lead to? It leads to greater productivity. It leads to being able to exploit resources more completely, right? So it leads to a system of cooperation that exploits the environment that the human community has found itself in. So what are women submitting to? Half the human race that has a particular skill set that enables it to exploit the environment for resources or to manage the environmental resources in such a way to sustain the tribe. That's what you think, that half the human race evolved to be deadweight? No. Men evolved their own skill set to contribute to humanity in order for humanity to continue. Otherwise, they would just be a bottleneck on reproduction. And you might as well just have twice as many females, because then you'll have twice as many babies, right? But no, men provide something. They provide an understanding of systems. They provide, and that understanding of systems enables them to maximize the exploitation of the environment. Enables them to not just maximize their individual exploitation of the environment, but their cooperative exploitation of the environment, of which one symptom is war. All right? So what are women submitting to? They are submitting their emotional primacy to men's ability to systematize and understand systems. And they are doing so for the benefit of everyone. Right? But again, women don't like that. They really don't like being wrong. They really, because of that very emotional primacy, that idea that women are the first thing we belong to, they're the first smile we ever see. That makes women want to be right. They want to be the center of everything. And so they embrace this narrative that justifies, once again, why they don't have to listen to men. Why men don't know what they're talking about. Why men are sex pests and degenerates and slimy, and they just don't have any moral authority. How can somebody who's constantly motivated by sex have anything to offer the world except his gross horniness. Right? This delegitimates men and men's contributions. And it subordinates men to women morally, meaning that men don't have a perspective that's worth talking about. Men don't have skills that are worth listening to. And even if you don't agree, right? And once again, women get to be right. Okay, women get to talk over men, to talk down to men, and to silence men because of this narrative. And again, like I just said, even if you don't think it's right that men and women are equally sexually abusive, here's another wrinkle. Men who engage in sexual violence are more genetically distinct from normal men who don't than straight men are from gay. Okay? They are a completely separate category of man. And saying that the average man has to answer to their particular impulses is like, well, okay, it's more ridiculous than going up to a straight man in your life and saying, can you tell me why men like cock? Why men like to suck cock? Like, do that for, like, just before you even blame or conflate normal men with men who seek out situations where their partners can't consent, which is a paraphilia, it's a fetish, it's a subcategory, and it's twice as genetically distinct as straight men are from gay. Before you conflate these two groups of men, I suggest you go up and ask a straight man why he likes to suck cock, because that's what you're doing. You are conflating two completely different categories that do not share anything. There is more shared between a straight man and a gay man sexually than a rapist and a normal man. Okay? So you can't, these people, these individuals have nothing to do with normal men. And their behavior does not reflect on normal men, because normal men are normal, right? So even if you're like, oh, I don't know, I just don't think that, even though there's plenty of evidence that it might be the case that women sexually aggress just as men, and even the Bible warned us about that in several instances, but I don't know, I just can't get behind that. Then get behind the fact that rapists are not normal men. So there's no reason to conflate their behavior with normal men. And it's not justified, and it's actually misandrous to do so. Okay? But anyway, I really think that this is something that, and if you're a woman listening and you're like, oh my God, I mean, just me saying, you as a woman, like, you're not less likely to rape than a man. If that offends you before you've even looked at the research that I have suggesting it's true, why? Is it that important to always be right? Is it that important to always be centered? Is that important to always be morally dominant? Because I can tell you, I've looked through it all, and it's not something that when I was watching, when I realized this, I'm like, oh, that's so every single freaking culture, huh? Every single freaking culture, you got to actually submit to men, huh? You know, that didn't fit well. That didn't sit well with me. I had to really think about it and contend with it for a long time before I realized, oh yeah, actually that makes sense. Because why would half the human race evolve to be biologically different, to have a different approach, if it wasn't important in some way? And also, women tend to really dominate emotionally and socially. So it sort of makes sense that, you know, in order to have an advanced civilization, you got to tell women to sit down and shut up and listen to the other half of the human race that obviously has something to add to the conversation. And again, it doesn't make sense unless women have some power that they need to submit in the first place. So anyway, this is why I think that this particular narrative is really valued by the left, the right, the deep state, and women. And I think that if you do not start challenging it, at least along some axis, I mean, maybe you're not ready to be like me and be like, yeah, I think that women probably are about as sexually aggressive as men, or not just sexually aggressive, like sexually violent. Sexual aggression is just sexual aggression, but I'm talking about sexual violence, that women are as sexually violent as men. Maybe you're not ready to go there yet, even though I have the evidence that it's entirely possible. And really the only honest conclusion you can make from the evidence that I've seen is yes, women are probably sexually as violent as men, or we need to do more research because we don't know. Those are the two conclusions that seem to me to be acceptable. Even if you can't handle that, consider the fact that it's absolutely ridiculous to conflate normal men with rapists in any capacity whatsoever. And consider that rapists are so despised by normal men that even other criminal men will kill them. Like the violence, homophobic violence is nothing in relation to the violence against men who rape. They are loathed on a visceral level by almost every category of man except them. Right? I don't know about female rapists. They seem to get a lot of passes. But so how can you conflate these two? Okay. So this, I think, is long enough. Those are my thoughts. Thank you for listening to me for this length of time as I have laid out my hypothesis. And have a lovely evening, afternoon, sunken brunch, whatever you're doing. And come on, do it. Do it. I'm doing the thing. Yay! And come on. You can do it. Come on. I'm going to get spiders. I'm not going to get hearts. Let's see. Come on. Come on, you. Come on. Give us a heart. Give us a heart. Come on. Ah, there we go. Ah, cute. All right. Thank you for your kind attention and have a lovely evening. Bye.
You know, after I recorded that, I forgot to mention the biggest reason why the deep state likes the male sex monster narrative. And that's because it tears men and women apart, and single women vote for the deep state.